I'm Iris, 24 female. I live in a small, third-floor apartment that always smells faintly of old paper and vanilla-scented candles, a comforting aroma I've cultivated since moving out on my own. By day, I'm a librarian, finding solace in the quiet rustle of pages and the orderly system of the Dewey Decimal System. My life is simple, structured, and until recently, built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies I never knew existed. For years, I believed my father was a distant figure, both geographically and emotionally, a man who sent birthday cards but little else. The truth, however, was far more sinister and involved $20,000 of his love that was stolen from me, dollar, by my own mother. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Life with my mother, Helen, was like living in a perfectly curated museum exhibit. Everything had its place, from the polished silverware we only used for guests to the carefully managed conversations we had about our lives. Helen was a community manager for a high-end condominium association, a job that suited her perfectly. She excelled at maintaining appearances, smoothing over conflicts with a saccharine smile, and ensuring that everything looked perfect on the surface, no matter the reality churning beneath. Our home, a pristine suburban house with a manicured lawn and perpetually blooming rose bushes, was her masterpiece. My stepfather, Richard, was the silent partner in this exhibit. A financial advisor with a quiet, almost unnerving demeanor, he moved through our home like a shadow. His presence felt more in the rigid budget discussions and the lectures on fiscal responsibility than in any real emotional connection. He and my mother were a perfect match. They were both architects of control, building a world where every variable was accounted for and every outcome was predetermined. I was, for the most part, a compliant piece of their collection. I studied hard, got a scholarship to a local university to avoid student debt, a point of immense pride for Richard, and secured a respectable, if not glamorous, job as a librarian. I was the good daughter, the one who never caused trouble, the one who understood the importance of a stable, predictable life. My biological father, David, was the ghost in our machine. An engineering consultant who worked on massive infrastructure projects in remote corners of the world, he was a figure I knew mostly through pixelated video calls and postcards from places I couldn't pronounce. He and my mother had divorced when I was 5, a split that Helen described with a weary sigh as inevitable. "Your father chose his career over his family, Iris," she would say, her voice tinged with a practiced sadness. "He loves you, of course, but from a distance. It's just his way." I accepted this narrative because I had no reason not to. The evidence seemed to support it. Every year on my birthday, a card would arrive with a crisp $50 bill tucked inside, accompanied by a short, neatly written message. "Happy birthday, Iris. Love, Dad." It was reliable, consistent, and deeply impersonal. It felt like an obligation, a box he ticked off a list once a year before returning to his blueprints and construction sites. The financial support my mother lamented never receiving from him seemed to materialize in other ways: our comfortable house, my tuition-free education, the general ease of our middle-class life. I assumed Richard's salary as a financial advisor was more than enough to cover everything. Helen often complained about money, sighing dramatically over bills at the kitchen table, but we never seemed to truly want for anything. These sighs, I would later learn, were part of the performance. The lie began to unravel on a Tuesday, a day so ordinary it was offensive in its mundanity. I was helping my mother clean out the attic, a space she avoided because it was the one part of the house that refused to be perfectly curated. It was a dusty, cluttered limbo of forgotten things: holiday decorations, old furniture, and boxes of my childhood relics. My task was to sort through my old school projects and decide what was worth keeping. Helen, meanwhile, was tackling a stack of old financial records she intended to shred. "No point in keeping this stuff around," she declared, "just creates clutter." As I sifted through crayon drawings and report cards, a small, unassuming wooden box caught my eye. It was a simple thing, a cigar box I recognized as my father's. He'd kept odds and ends in it, and I remembered being fascinated by its contents as a child: foreign coins, interesting-looking rocks, and old keys that unlocked nothing. I hadn't seen it in years. "Mom, look what I found," I said, holding it up. Helen glanced over, her smile tig. "T.O., that old thing. Your father left it behind, probably nothing but junk in there." Her attempt at nonchalance was a fraction too slow, her eyes lingering on the box for a moment too long. A flicker of something, was it panic? Crossed her face before being smoothed over by her usual placid expression. It was a tiny crack in her carefully maintained facade, but it was enough to pique my curiosity. Later that evening, after the attic was tidied and the shredder had done its work, I took the box to my apartment. The air was thick with the scent of an impending storm, and the silence of my small living room felt amplified. I sat on my floor, the box in my lap, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst the familiar trinkets, was a stack of letters, tied together with a faded red ribbon. They were addressed to me, in my father's familiar, neat handwriting. But these weren't birthday cards. There were dozens of them, dating back to my 18th birthday. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The date was from 6 years ago, a week after I'd officially become an adult. "My dearest Iris," it began, the words so different from the terse greetings in his cards. "I know I can't be there to celebrate with you, but I am so incredibly proud of the young woman you've become. I wanted to give you something to help you start this new chapter of your life. I've set up a monthly allowance for you, $300 a month to start. It's not a fortune, but I hope it will give you some freedom, a little breathing room as you navigate college and beyond. The money will be deposited into the joint account I still share with your mother. She has promised me she will transfer it to you each month. Use it for books, for fun, for savings, for whatever you need. This is for you, and you alone." I read the letter again, and then a third time. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic, panicked drumbeat. $300 a month, for 6 years. I did the math in my head, my mind struggling to process the numbers. That was $3,600 a year. Over 6 years, that was $21,600. A wave of nausea washed over me. I had never received a single cent. I had worked part-time jobs all through college, scraping by to pay for gas, textbooks, and the occasional night out with friends. I had listened to my mother and Richard lecture me on the importance of living within my means, of not being frivolous, all while a small fortune, my fortune, was being siphoned away. Frantically, I tore through the rest of the letters. Each one was filled with a warmth and affection I had never associated with my father. He asked about my studies, offered advice, and told me stories about the places he was seeing. And in every single letter, he mentioned the allowance, sometimes confirming he'd sent a little extra for Christmas or my birthday. He'd even written about a special $2,000 deposit he'd made as a graduation gift. A gift I had never known about. The foundation of my life, the carefully constructed narrative I had been fed for years, crumbled into dust. My mother hadn't just kept the money. She had hidden these letters. She had hidden my father from me. She had curated my perception of him as a distant, uncaring figure, all while methodically stealing the tangible proof of his love and support. The $50 bills in my birthday cards were a pittance, a token gesture designed to maintain the illusion while she pocketed the rest. The anger came first, a white-hot rage that burned through the shock. It was followed by a profound sense of betrayal that was so deep it felt like a physical wound. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the years of manipulation, the calculated deception. My entire relationship with my father, my understanding of my own family, was a lie. And the architect of that lie was the one person in the world who was supposed to protect me. I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my father's love and my mother's treachery, and for the first time in my life, I felt the quiet, compliant part of me die, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Helen had built her perfect world on a foundation of lies, and I was going to be the one to tear it all down. The next few days passed in a blur of suppressed fury. I went to work, stamped books, and answered questions about late fees with a calm, detached professionalism that felt entirely alien to the storm raging inside me. At home, I reread my father's letters, each word a fresh wound. I laid them out in chronological order, tracing the narrative of a relationship I'd been denied. He had tried to be a part of my life, not just financially, but emotionally. He had asked questions that Helen had never bothered to relay, let alone answer. "How is your art history class? Are you still painting?" He'd asked in one letter. I had abandoned painting in my freshman year of college because I couldn't afford the supplies. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. My mother called me twice during that time, her voice cheerful and oblivious. "Just checking in, sweetie. How's my favorite librarian?" The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I kept my replies short and noncommittal, blaming a headache for my lack of enthusiasm. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. I was operating on pure, unadulterated rage, and a premature confrontation would be messy and unproductive. Helen was a master of manipulation. She would twist my words, feign ignorance, and paint me as the ungrateful, hysterical daughter. To beat her at her own game, I needed more than just a box of old letters. I needed irrefutable proof. I needed a strategy. My first step was to contact my father. For years, our communication had been filtered through my mother. She would arrange the video calls, always conveniently present, steering the conversation towards safe, superficial topics. I realized now that she had been acting as a gatekeeper, controlling the flow of information in both directions. Finding his direct contact information was surprisingly easy. His consulting firm had a website with a Contact Us page. I sent a generic email through the official portal, simply stating that I was his daughter and needed to speak with him urgently about a personal family matter. I didn't know if it would reach him directly, but it was a start. While I waited for a response, I turned my attention to my paternal grandmother, Sophia. After the divorce, my mother had systematically distanced us from my father's side of the family. Visits with Sophia, once a regular and cherished part of my childhood, became infrequent and then stopped altogether. The official reason was that the 3-hour drive was just too much, but now I suspected other motives. Sophia was my father's mother. She would have known the truth. Sophia lived in a charming, cluttered house filled with antiques from her retired shop. She was a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, and she had never been a fan of Helen. When I called her, her voice was a mixture of surprise and delight. "Iris, what a lovely surprise. It's been too long." "I know, Grandma, I'm so sorry about that. Life gets busy," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "Life or your mother?" she asked, her tone dry. There was no judgment, just a simple, knowing question. I took a deep breath. "Grandma, I need to ask you something. It's about Dad and Mom." I drove to see her that weekend. As soon as I walked through her door, the familiar scent of lemon polish and old wood enveloping me, she pulled me into a fierce hug. "You look too thin," she declared, holding me at arm's length. "Helen isn't feeding you." We sat in her sun-drenched living room, drinking tea from delicate porcelain cups. I told her everything. I showed her the box, the letters, my frantic calculations on a crumpled piece of paper. She listened intently, her expression hardening with each new detail. When I finished, she placed her teacup down with a decisive click. "I knew it," she said, her voice a low growl. "I knew that woman was a snake. David told me about the allowance years ago. He was so proud, so happy he could provide for you in that way. When I would ask you about it on the rare occasions Helen allowed us to speak, you never mentioned it. I just assumed you were a private girl, that you didn't want to discuss finances. I even brought it up to David, but he said Helen assured him you were getting the money and were just being discreet about it. He trusted her, the fool." Her words were a painful confirmation, but also a relief. I wasn't going crazy. This was real. "He told me he had set up a joint account with her," I said, "for the transfers." Sophia nodded grimly. "Yes, the old joint account they kept open after the divorce for shared expenses related to raising a child, as Helen put it, more like her personal slush fund." She stood up and walked over to an ornate writing desk. "Your father, bless his heart, is a brilliant engineer, but he can be too trusting. He believed that no mother would ever steal from her own child. She rummaged through a drawer and pulled out a thick file folder. I, on the other hand, never trusted Helen as far as I could throw her. After your father told me about the arrangement, I had my doubts. So, I did a little digging. She handed me the folder. It contained bank statements. Your father gave me online access to that joint account years ago, so I could help him manage things from this end if ever there was an emergency. I was only supposed to look if he asked me to. I broke that rule once, about 4 years ago. I had a feeling something was off. These are the statements for a 6-month period. My hands shook as I looked at the papers. There they were, clear as day, monthly deposits from my father's international bank, labeled Iris Allowance. And every month, within a day or two of the deposit, there was a corresponding transfer out. But the money wasn't going to me. It was being moved to another account, an account held jointly by Helen and Richard. Some months, smaller amounts were withdrawn in cash. Other times, the money went directly toward a credit card payment, a card I recognized from my mother's wallet. The scale of the deception was more methodical than I could have imagined. This wasn't a desperate mother borrowing money she intended to pay back. This was calculated, long-term theft, aided and abetted by her new husband. Richard, the financial advisor, the man who preached fiscal prudence, was actively helping my mother steal from me. I wanted to tell you then, Sophia said, her voice soft with regret. But I didn't have the whole story, and honestly, I was afraid. Helen had so much control over your life. I was worried she would cut you off from me completely if I interfered. I told myself I was protecting you, but I was just being a coward. You're not a coward, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You're the only one who suspected anything. You have no idea how much this helps. Just then my phone buzzed. It was an email. The subject line read, "From David." My heart leaped into my throat. I opened it quickly. The email was short and to the point. Iris, I'm not sure what this is about, but I've been trying to reach you for years outside of the calls your mother sets up. She always said you were too busy with your studies or work to talk. I'm currently in a remote location with sporadic internet, but I will be in a major city with a stable connection in 2 days. Let's schedule a video call then. Here is my personal number and WhatsApp. Please contact me directly. Love. Dad. The dam broke. The tears I had been holding back for days finally came, hot and furious. He had been trying to reach me. My mother hadn't just stolen his money. She had stolen his voice, his attempts to connect, painting him as the distant father while she was the one holding the scissors, snipping every thread he tried to send my way. Sophia put a comforting arm around me. There, child, let it out. This is the beginning of the end for her. We have the letters, we have the bank statements, and now you have your father back. Her perfectly curated world is about to come crashing down. I wiped my tears, a cold resolve settling in my chest. My grandmother was right. This was just the beginning. The whispers from across the ocean had finally become a shout, and soon everyone was going to hear it. The 2 days I had to wait to speak with my father felt like an eternity. I spent the time at my grandmother's house, poring over the bank statements she had saved. Together, we were a team of amateur forensic accountants, tracing the flow of stolen money. The patterns were sickeningly clear. The deposits from my father arrived like clockwork around the first of the month. The withdrawals by my mother and Richard were more sporadic. A few $100s transferred to their joint account here, a $1,000 credit card payment there. They were treating my allowance as their personal emergency fund, a secret source of income to plug the gaps in their lifestyle. I cross-referenced the dates of the larger withdrawals with my memory. One $500 withdrawal corresponded with the weekend my mother and Richard had spent at a luxury spa for their anniversary. Another, for nearly $1,000, was dated just 2 days before my mother bought a new designer handbag that she had claimed was a ridiculously good find at an outlet store. The lies were so blatant, so audacious. They had been flaunting their theft in my face for years. The most damning piece of evidence we found was related to my graduation. My father's letter had mentioned a special $2,000 gift. On the bank statement from that month, there it was, a wire transfer for that exact amount, labeled "Congrats Grad." 2 days later, there was a withdrawal for $2,000, paid directly to a local car dealership. I remembered that week vividly. Richard had come home with a new set of expensive golf clubs, boasting about the unbelievable deal he had gotten. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. My graduation gift had paid for my stepfather's new hobby. The thought made me physically ill. While I was drowning in financial records, Sophia was on a mission of her own. She started making quiet phone calls to old family friends, people who had known our family both before and after the divorce. She was fishing, she said, for information about Helen and Richard's financial situation. Her instincts, as always, were spot on. The picture that emerged was one of a couple living far beyond their means. Richard's career as a financial advisor was not as successful as they portrayed it to be. He had lost a few key clients in a market downturn. Helen's salary was decent, but not enough to fund their country club membership, their annual vacations, or her penchant for designer labels. They were drowning in debt, and my father's monthly allowance was the secret life raft keeping them afloat. Their perfect life was a house of cards, built with stolen money. Finally, the day of the call arrived. I set up my laptop in Sophia's quiet study, my hands clammy and my stomach in knots. When his face appeared on the screen, he looked older than I remembered, his face more lined, but his eyes were the same kind blue I recognized from old photographs. "Iris," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's so good to see you, really see you." "You too, Dad," I managed to say, my own voice choked. There were no pleasantries, no small talk. I launched into the story, my words tumbling out in a rush. I told him about the box, the letters, the bank statements. I shared everything Sophia and I had uncovered. I held up one of the letters to the camera, my hands shaking. As I spoke, his expression shifted from confusion to shock, then to a slow-burning, incandescent rage. His face, usually so calm and thoughtful, became a thundercloud. "She told me," he started, his voice low and dangerous. "She told me you were receiving the money. She said you were grateful but that you were fiercely independent and didn't like to talk about it. She said you were thriving, that you didn't need anything from me. She even sent me a thank you letter, supposedly from you, after you graduated. She said you had dictated it to her over the phone because you were too busy with job applications to write one yourself." My blood ran cold. A thank you letter? I never wrote or dictated any letter, Dad. "I know that now," he said grimly. "I kept it. It's in a file at my apartment back in the States. The language. It sounded more like her than you. I should have known. I should have pushed harder, tried to contact you through other means. I trusted her. I didn't want to cause conflict for you." His regret and self-recrimination were palpable, and I felt a surge of empathy for him. He was a victim in this too. Helen had played us both, isolating us from each other and feeding us a narrative that suited her agenda. "It's not your fault," I said firmly. "She's a professional manipulator. She built a wall between us, but we're tearing it down now." He nodded, a determined set to his jaw. "Damn right we are. Iris, I am so sorry for all of it, for not being there, for not seeing through her lies. We are going to fix this. First things first, I'm cutting off her access to that account immediately. I'll need to do it through the bank's international line, which might take a day or two, but it's my top priority. Second, I'm flying home. My current project is wrapping up. I can be back in the States in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. It felt like a lifetime away, but it was a concrete timeline, a light at the end of the tunnel. "What do we do until then?" I asked. "We gather our ammunition," he said, his voice hardening. "I have years of financial records on my end. I'll get you copies of every transfer I ever made. I want you to go to the bank here. Tell them you're my daughter and that you suspect fraudulent activity on the account. They may not give you full access, but they might be able to provide you with a full history of the withdrawals. We need every single piece of evidence we can find. When I get back, we're confronting her. And she's going to pay back every single cent." The call ended with a promise to talk every day. As I closed my laptop, I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt before. My father was on my side. He was coming home. We had a plan. The next day, armed with a letter of authorization my father had emailed me and a copy of my birth certificate, I walked into the bank that held the joint account. The branch manager was a stern-looking woman who initially seemed skeptical. But as I laid out my story, calmly and rationally, and presented the documents, her expression softened. "Due to privacy laws, I can't give you access to an account you're not a signatory on," she explained. "However, given the circumstances and the authorization from your father, I can launch an internal fraud investigation. We can flag the account and provide you with a record of all outgoing transfers for the past 7 years." It was more than I had hoped for. I walked out of the bank an hour later with a thick envelope. It contained a detailed history of the account, a paper trail of my mother's betrayal. Every spa day, every designer purchase, every payment toward their car loan, it was all there, funded by money meant for me. That night, back in my own apartment, I looked at the pile of evidence I had accumulated. The letters, my grandmother's statements, the official bank records, the promise of my father's return. The anger was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. But it was now accompanied by something else, a steely sense of determination. My mother had underestimated me. She had seen me as a quiet, compliant child who would never question the world she had built. She had no idea that the librarian she had raised had just learned how to read the fine print. And I was about to hold her accountable for every single word. The 3 weeks leading up to my father's return were the longest of my life. I operated on 2 separate tracks. On one, I was the dutiful daughter, the quiet librarian. I answered my mother's calls, made excuses for why I was too busy to come for dinner, and listened to her complain about her stressful job and Richard's demanding clients. Each conversation was a masterclass in self-control. I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming, to keep from exposing the whole rotten charade right then and there. But I stuck to the plan. My father and I had agreed we would not move until we had every piece of the puzzle in place. A premature move would give her time to hide assets, destroy evidence, and spin a new web of lies. On the other track, I was a detective. My evenings and weekends were consumed by the investigation. With the full bank history in hand, my father and I, along with Sophia, spent hours on 3-way calls, meticulously piecing together the timeline of deceit. The bank records were our roadmap. My father's records showed the money flowing in, and the new statements showed exactly where it flowed out. The total amount stolen was staggering. My father's initial estimate of around $20,000 was low. He had forgotten about the extra deposits he'd made for holidays, the occasional, just because bonus he'd sent when he closed a big contract. When we tallied it all up, every monthly allowance, every graduation gift, every Christmas bonus, the grand total came to $28,450. The withdrawal patterns showed a clear escalation. In the beginning, Helen had been cautious, taking out small amounts, likely telling herself it was just a loan she would pay back. But as the years went on and she faced no consequences, her withdrawals became bolder. The money was funneled into 3 main areas: credit card debt, car payments, and direct transfers to a high-yield savings account in her and Richard's names. This was perhaps the most galling discovery. They weren't just stealing my money to cover their expenses. They were stealing it to build their own savings, earning interest on money that was rightfully mine. Richard, the financial advisor, had created a portfolio for themselves funded by fraud. Sophia, using her network of local gossips and old friends, provided the color commentary to the black and white data of the bank statements. "Remember that trip to Italy the Martins took 3 years ago?" she'd say, her voice triumphant over the phone. Helen told everyone they got an amazing last-minute deal. Well, I just spoke to Carol, who is friends with their travel agent. There was no deal. They paid full price, first class. And wouldn't you know it, their departure date was 3 days after a $4,000 cash withdrawal from your account. Piece by piece, we built our case. We created a spreadsheet, a damning document that listed every single suspicious transaction, the date, amount, and a corresponding note about what we believed the money was used for. The Italy trip, the golf clubs, a down payment on Richard's new car, monthly payments to a high-end department store credit card. It was all there. During this time, I also reconnected with my father on a level I never had before. We talked for hours, not just about the plan, but about life. He told me about his work, the challenges and triumphs of building bridges and dams in the middle of nowhere. I told him about my passion for books, my dream of one day opening a small, independent bookstore. I sent him photos of my apartment, my friends, my cat. He, in turn, sent me photos of his life, sunsets over deserts, bustling foreign markets, the small, Spartan room he called home on his job sites. I was discovering my father, the man my mother had tried to erase. He was kind, funny, and deeply remorseful about the lost years. "When this is over," he promised, "we're making up for lost time. A trip, anywhere you want to go, my treat." A week before my father was due to arrive, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Richard. His tone was breezy, but I could detect an undercurrent of something else, unease. "Hey, Iris, your mom mentioned you've been a bit distant lately. Everything okay?" he asked. "Just busy with work," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Right. Well, listen, the reason I'm calling is a bit awkward. It's about your mom's birthday next month. I wanted to get her something really special, a new laptop. Hers is ancient. I was thinking, maybe you'd like to go in on it with me? Split the cost." The audacity of it was breathtaking. He was asking me for money to buy a gift for the woman who had stolen nearly $30,000 from me. The rage that I had been keeping simmering on a low boil threatened to spill over. I took a slow, deep breath. "I don't think I can swing that right now, Richard," I said, my voice colder than I intended. He was silent for a moment. "Oh, okay. Well, no problem, just thought I'd ask. You know, with your dad not really contributing, I thought." He let the sentence hang in the air, a pathetic attempt at guilt-tripping me. He was testing the waters, trying to see if I still believed the narrative of the deadbeat dad. "You know, Richard," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "I think you'd be surprised at how much my dad contributes. I'll have to pass on the laptop. I'm saving up for something important." I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking. He suspected something. The flow of money had stopped. My father had successfully frozen the account 2 weeks prior. Helen hadn't mentioned it yet, which meant she either hadn't noticed, unlikely, or she was trying to figure out what was going on without tipping her hand. Richard's call was a fishing expedition. They were getting nervous. The call solidified my resolve. My plan had initially been to confront them privately, with just my father and me. But Richard's involvement, his complicity in not just the theft but the emotional manipulation, changed things. They had built their reputation, their entire social standing, on a foundation of lies. Their punishment shouldn't just be financial. It needed to be social. It needed to be public. I called my grandmother. "Grandma," I said, "I have an idea for how we're going to handle this, but I'm going to need your help. Are you still friendly with Helen's sister, my Aunt Carol?" Sophia chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Carol and I have our differences, but we both agree on one thing. Helen has always been far too impressed with herself. What do you have in mind, dear?" I laid out my new plan. A family dinner. A reckoning. A carefully orchestrated piece of theater where Helen and Richard would be the star attractions, and their web of deceit would be unraveled in front of the very people whose opinions they valued most. It was ruthless. It was dramatic. And it was exactly what they deserved. The trail of financial deceit had led me here, and I was ready to set it on fire. My father arrived on a crisp autumn evening. I met him at the airport, and the moment I saw him walking through the arrival's gate, a wave of emotion washed over me. He was just a man, not the mythical, distant figure from my childhood. We hugged, a long, slightly awkward embrace that slowly melted into something genuine. The 20 years of distance between us felt both immense and insignificant. We spent the next 2 days in a hotel near the airport, our war room. We spread our evidence across the king-sized bed. The spreadsheet, the bank statements, my father's letters, and a new document. A legally binding repayment agreement my father had drafted with the help of his company's lawyer. It stipulated that Helen and Richard would repay the full amount of $28,450, with interest, over a period of 2 years. It also included a non-disclosure clause, but with a critical exception. The clause would be voided if they ever slandered my father or me, or if they defaulted on a payment. It was a perfectly constructed trap. My role in the plan was to set the stage. I called my mother. "Hey, Mom," I said, injecting a warmth into my voice that I didn't feel. "I know I've been a little distant lately, and I feel bad about it. I was thinking I'd like to host a family dinner at my apartment, to clear the air and celebrate some good news." "Good news?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "I'll tell you all about it at dinner," I said mysteriously. "I was thinking this Saturday. I'm inviting Aunt Carol and Uncle Joe, and Grandma Sophia is going to come into town for it too." The inclusion of her sister, Carol, and Sophia was a calculated move. Carol was a notorious gossip, the unofficial news agency of our extended family. Sophia's presence would lend a gravitas and an unimpeachable moral authority to our side. Helen couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. As I expected, her desire to maintain the appearance of a happy, close-knit family won out. She agreed immediately, promising to bring her famous 7-layer salad. Next, I called Sophia. "The trap is set," I told her. She confirmed that she had already spoken to Carol, planting a few seeds of doubt. She had casually mentioned that David was coming to town for a surprise family announcement, and that Iris seemed to be coming into some money. She knew Carol wouldn't be able to resist the bait. The final piece of the alliance was my Aunt Carol herself. This was the riskiest part of the plan. I drove out to see her the day before the dinner. I laid out the entire story for her and her husband, Joe. I showed them a curated selection of the evidence, enough to be damning, but not so much as to be overwhelming. Carol's reaction was a mixture of shock and, I suspect, a small amount of sibling schadenfreude. She and my mother had always had a competitive relationship. "I can't believe she would do that," Carol said, shaking her head. "To her own daughter, Richard too, I always thought he was a bit of a stuffed shirt." "We're going to confront her tomorrow night," I explained. "We're not trying to destroy her, but we are demanding that she pay the money back. My father and I would appreciate your support. We just want you there as witnesses to ensure she can't twist the story later." As I had hoped, the appeal to her sense of justice and her love for drama was irresistible. She agreed to be there and to act as a neutral party. The alliance was forged. We had our victim, me, our enforcer, my father, our moral authority, Sophia, and our witnesses, Carol and Joe. Saturday arrived. My small apartment felt charged with an electric tension. Sophia and my father arrived early. We went over the plan one last time. My father would lead the confrontation. He had the calm, authoritative presence needed to control the room. I would present the evidence. Sophia would be our silent, watchful judge. My aunt and uncle arrived next, their faces a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Finally, the guests of honor arrived. Helen and Richard walked in, all smiles and pleasantries. Helen presented her salad with a flourish, while Richard handed me a bottle of cheap wine. They looked around my small apartment, a hint of condescension in their eyes. "This is cozy Iris," my mother said, her eyes scanning the bookshelves. The first hour was excruciatingly normal. We made small talk about the weather, work, and sports. My father, to his credit, played the part of the long-lost dad perfectly, asking Richard about the stock market and complimenting Helen on her salad. I watched my mother and Richard slowly relax, their initial nervousness giving way to their usual smug confidence. They thought this was just a dinner. They had no idea they were walking into an ambush. I served coffee and dessert. As I placed a slice of cake in front of my mother, I took a deep breath. This was the moment. "Actually," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the chatter, "there's something else. The good news I mentioned." All eyes turned to me. Helen smiled indulgently. Well, don't keep us in suspense, sweetie. I looked at my father. He gave me a slight nod. My good news, I said, my eyes locking onto my mother's, is that I've recently come into a rather large sum of money. $28,450 to be exact. It was a gift from my father, an allowance he's been sending me for the past 6 years. The effect was instantaneous. The color drained from Helen's face. Richard, who had been mid-sip of coffee, froze, the cup hovering in front of his lips. The air in the room became thick and heavy. I don't know what you're talking about, my mother stammered, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape. Oh, I think you do, my father said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. He stood up and placed a file folder on the dining table. We can start with the letters you hid, Helen, or perhaps the bank statements showing your withdrawals. We have a lot to discuss. The ambush was sprung. The carefully constructed facade of their perfect life was about to be shattered, and we had a captive audience to watch it fall. The silence that followed my father's statement was deafening. Helen stared at the file folder on the table as if it were a venomous snake. Richard finally placed his coffee cup down, his hand trembling slightly. Aunt Carol and Uncle Joe exchanged a wide-eyed glance, their roles as neutral witnesses now front and center. This is ridiculous, Helen finally sputtered, finding her voice. She attempted a laugh, but it came out as a strangled, desperate sound. David, what on earth are you talking about? Iris, sweetie, I think you've misunderstood something. She turned her gaze on me, her eyes pleading, but with a flicker of menace behind them. This was her go-to move, feigned confusion followed by an attempt to frame me as hysterical or naive. It wasn't going to work this time. There's no misunderstanding, Mom, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I opened the folder and slid the top document across the table toward her. It was a copy of the first letter my father had written to me on my 18th birthday, the one detailing the new allowance. Your handwriting is on the envelope. You received it. You just chose not to give it to me. She glanced at it, her face a mask of crumbling denial. I was managing it for you. You were so young, so irresponsible with money. I was putting it aside, saving it for you. Saving it in your own savings account and earning interest on it? My father interjected, his voice dangerously quiet. He slid another document across the table, the statement showing the transfer of my money into their high-yield savings account. Saving it to make a down payment on Richard's car, or to pay for your vacation to Italy. With each question, he produced another piece of evidence. The car dealership invoice. The credit card statement with the charges for airline tickets and hotels. The spreadsheet, a neat, orderly catalog of their crimes, was the centerpiece. Richard, who had been silent until now, decided to speak. Now, hold on a minute, he said, puffing up his chest in a weak imitation of authority. This is a private family matter. There's no need to air our dirty laundry in front of everyone. He shot a glare at Carol and Joe. I agree, my father said smoothly. This is a family matter. A matter of a mother and her husband stealing from their own child. And since you seem to think of Carol and Joe as outsiders, let's be clear. They are here as witnesses to ensure that what happens in this room is accurately remembered. Carol, seizing her moment, chimed in. Helen, I can't believe this. All those years you complained about money, about David not helping out, you were sitting on a secret bank account. The betrayal from her own sister seemed to hit Helen harder than anything else. Her face crumpled. The fight went out of her, replaced by a sullen, petulant anger. You don't understand, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. We were struggling. The market was down. Richard's bonuses were cut. We had a lifestyle to maintain. We were going to pay it back. When? I asked, my voice cutting through her pathetic excuses. When were you going to pay it back? When you were asking me to chip in for your new laptop last week? Or maybe after you had earned enough interest on my money to fund another vacation? The room fell silent again. The truth, stark and ugly, was laid bare on the dining table. There were no more lies for them to hide behind. My father took the final document from the folder. It was the repayment agreement. He placed it in front of Helen and Richard along with a pen. "This is not a negotiation," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This is the final invoice. You will repay the full amount, $28,450 plus 5% interest, calculated from the date of each withdrawal. The payments will be made monthly, directly to an account that I will set up for Iris. You have 2 years to pay it back in full." Richard picked up the document, his face pale as he scanned the legal jargon. "This is extortion," he hissed. "No," my father replied, his eyes like chips of ice. "This is restitution. The alternative is a lawsuit, and fraud, Richard, is a very serious crime. I imagine a fraud conviction would be devastating for a financial advisor's career. We also have the option of filing a police report. Theft is theft." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Richard looked at Helen, but she was staring at her hands, defeated. The choice was simple: sign the paper and manage the debt in private, or face public humiliation, legal action, and professional ruin. After a long, tense moment, Richard snatched the pen and scribbled his signature on the document. He pushed it toward Helen. With a trembling hand, she signed her name. "The first payment is due on the 1st of next month," my father said, collecting the signed papers. "And one more thing, you will both apologize to Iris. Right now." It was the most pathetic apology I had ever heard. A mumbled "I'm sorry" from Richard, his eyes fixed on the wall. A tearful "I'm so sorry, sweetie, I never meant to hurt you" from my mother, a performance for the benefit of her sister. It meant nothing to me. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. "I think it's time for you to leave," I said, standing up. They practically fled. They didn't even take the 7-layer salad. As the door closed behind them, a profound sense of relief washed over me. The weight I had been carrying for weeks, the anger and the betrayal, finally began to lift. It wasn't over. They still had to pay back the money. But the confrontation, the moment of truth, was done. Aunt Carol came over and gave me a hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." We spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, for the first time in years. Sophia, my father, my aunt and uncle, and me, we were a fractured family, piecing ourselves back together. The final invoice had been delivered, and the debt was now officially on the books. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a new kind of quiet settled over my life. The angry, frantic energy that had propelled me through the investigation was gone, replaced by a sense of calm clarity. The relationship with my mother and Richard was, for all intents and purposes, over. Helen sent me a few long, rambling text messages in the days that followed, full of self-pity and excuses. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. The signed repayment agreement W. as the only communication we needed. True to their word, the first payment appeared in my new bank account on the 1st of the month. It was a substantial amount, enough to make me believe they were taking the agreement seriously. Seeing that money, my money, finally where it belonged, was a strange feeling. It wasn't a victory, not really. It was a reclamation. The real victory was my relationship with my father. He extended his stay for another 2 weeks. We filled the lost years with simple, everyday things. We went to museums, cooked dinner together, and took long walks in the park. He told me stories about my childhood that I had long forgotten, and I introduced him to the woman I had become. It was a delicate, tentative process, but with each passing day, the bond between us grew stronger. He was no longer a ghost. He was my dad. Before he left for his next overseas assignment, we planned the trip he had promised me. 6 months from now, we would meet in Spain and walk a portion of the Camino de Santiago, a pilgrimage to mark our new beginning. My grandmother, Sophia, was the quiet hero of the whole affair. She had been my first ally, my source of strength when I was drowning in doubt. Our relationship, which my mother had tried so hard to sever, was now stronger than ever. I made a promise to myself to drive down and see her at least once a month, a promise I have kept without fail. The story, as I expected, spread through the family like wildfire, courtesy of Aunt Carol. The fallout for Helen and Richard was swift and severe. They were not ostracized publicly, but they were met with a new, cool distance from relatives who now knew the truth. Their social standing, which they had so desperately tried to protect, was irrevocably tarnished. I heard from my aunt that they had to sell their house, the pristine exhibit hall I had grown up in, and move to a smaller, less impressive townhouse across town. The country club membership was canceled. The designer handbags disappeared. They were forced to live within their actual means, a punishment that, for them, was likely more painful than any legal sentence. As for me, the money changed my life, but not in the ways one might expect. I didn't go on a wild spending spree. I didn't quit my job. The first thing I did was pay off the small amount of credit card debt I had accumulated in the years I had struggled to make ends meet. The second thing I did was invest a significant portion in a retirement fund, a nod to the responsible future Richard had always preached about but had failed to practice.